The silver blade pierced through King Alaric's chest at precisely midnight, driven by the hand of his most trusted advisor. And in that frozen moment before the ancient vampire's knees buckled, the only face he saw in the crowd of conspirators was the one he'd spent 3 centuries trying to forget. The maid he'd banished 5 years ago, now standing in the doorway with evidence that would damn them all. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The Grand Council chamber erupted into chaos. Councillor Matthias withdrew the blade with a sick, wet sound, and Alaric collapsed onto the obsidian floor, black blood pooling beneath his body. The 12 council members, vampires who had served the Nightborn dynasty for centuries, stood in a semicircle around their fallen king, their faces masks of triumph and anticipation. "It's done," Matthias announced, his voice carrying across the vaulted chamber. "The tyrant is dead. The Nightborn line ends tonight." But Elena Thorne, standing in the shadowed doorway with a leather satchel clutched to her chest, knew the truth they didn't. The blade hadn't been silver at all. It had been common steel, glamored with illusion magic. And Alaric, though wounded and weak, was not dead. Not yet. She had returned to the Obsidian Palace after 5 years of exile, 5 years of surviving in the harsh human territories beyond the vampire kingdoms, for one purpose: to save the king who had once saved her, and to expose the conspiracy that had manipulated them both. 5 years ago, Elena had been nothing, a human maid in the palace, cleaning the endless corridors and serving blood wine to immortal nobles who barely noticed her existence. She'd been invisible, which made her the perfect witness when she'd accidentally overheard Councillor Matthias and 3 others plotting treason in the restricted library. She'd done what any loyal servant would do. She'd reported it directly to King Alaric. That had been her first mistake. Her second had been believing the king would protect her. Instead, Alaric had summoned her to his private chambers in the dead of night, his silver eyes filled with something she couldn't read, regret perhaps, or resignation. "You must leave," had told her, his voice as cold as winter frost. "Tonight, take this purse and go beyond the border. Never speak of what you heard, never return to these lands. And perhaps you'll live to see old age." "But, Your Majesty, the council, they're planning." "I know what they're planning," had interrupted, and the weight of centuries had been in those words. "And you cannot stop it. Neither can I. Not yet. There are forces at work you cannot comprehend, girl. Powers older than this kingdom. If you stay, you become leverage against me. If you speak, you become a corpse. So I give you this one chance. Disappear." He'd handed her a small velvet purse heavy with gold coins, enough to buy a new life somewhere far from vampires and their intrigues. Then he'd turned away from her, a dismissal as final as a closing tomb. Elena had fled that night, heartbroken and confused. She'd made her way to the human port city of Ashenmore, where she'd worked as a seamstress, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. But she'd never stopped thinking about the vampire king with the sad silver eyes, or wondering what conspiracy she'd stumbled into that was so dangerous he'd exile an innocent servant to protect her. The truth had found her 6 months ago, in the form of a dying vampire named Lydia. Elena had discovered the woman in an alley behind her shop, her body broken and her life fading fast. Vampires didn't die easily. This one had been tortured systematically, professionally. In her final moments, Lydia had gripped Elena's hand with supernatural strength and whispered a name: Alaric. Warn Alaric. The convergence. 5 years. They'll strike during the crimson eclipse. Matthias leads them, but there's another, the real betrayer, in the shadows. Evidence in the vault. Blood of the covenant. Then she died, crumbling to ash in Elena's arms as the sun rose. Elena had spent the next 6 months investigating, using the gold Alaric had given her to bribe informants, hire scholars, and piece together the conspiracy. What she'd uncovered was staggering in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The council wasn't just plotting to overthrow Alaric. They were planning to break the blood covenant, an ancient magical pact between vampires and humans that had maintained peace for over 1,000 years. The covenant prevented vampires from turning humans without consent, restricted feeding to willing volunteers, and gave humans protections under vampire law. It was the foundation of civilization in the Nightborn territories. Breaking it would plunge the realm into chaos and war. More disturbing was what Elena had learned about the timing. The convergence was a rare astronomical event when 3 moons aligned, amplifying magic and weakening certain protections. It happened once every 5 years. The next convergence was tonight, and during the accompanying crimson eclipse, the blood covenant could be shattered if its guardian was killed in a specific ritual. That guardian was King Alaric Nightborn. The council planned to murder him during the eclipse, use his death to break the covenant, and then blame the act on human rebels, sparking a war that would give them the excuse to subjugate humanity completely. They would rule as tyrants over a new dark age, with Matthias as the puppet king and someone else, someone Lydia hadn't named, pulling the strings. Elena had gathered evidence. Stolen letters, testimony from frightened servants, documents from the forbidden vault that Lydia had somehow accessed before her death. It was enough to prove the conspiracy, but only if someone could get it to Alaric before the council struck. So, Elena had returned to the Obsidian Palace tonight, sneaking through the servants' passages she'd once cleaned, making her way to the council chamber where she knew the assassination would take place. She'd arrived just in time to see the blade enter the king's chest and to realize, with the scholar's knowledge she'd acquired, that the weapon was wrong. If they'd truly wanted to kill an ancient vampire king, they would have used a blessed silver blade, consecrated with holy water, or wood from a hanging tree, or any number of specialized weapons. Common steel, even glamored, would wound but not kill. They wanted Alaric alive for the ritual. The murder was theater for the other council members who weren't part of the inner conspiracy. The real betrayal would come next. As Alaric lay gasping on the floor, Matthias raised his hands for silence. "Brothers and sisters of the council, tonight we have freed ourselves from a tyrant's rule. But our work is not finished. We must complete the ritual of succession before the crimson eclipse ends, or the kingdom will fall into chaos." "What ritual?" demanded Councillor Vera, one of the older vampires. "There is no ritual of succession in our laws. The crown passes to the king's heir, or to the council collectively if there is no heir." "An ancient ritual," Matthias said smoothly, "one that predates our written laws. I have discovered it in the forbidden texts. It will stabilize the transfer of power and ensure our kingdom's strength." Elena's blood ran cold. This was it. The moment when they would turn the assassination into something far worse. But before Matthias could continue, Elena stepped fully into the chamber's light. "Stop," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Before you go any further, you need to see what I've brought." Every vampire in the room turned to stare at her. Several gasped in recognition. Matthias's face went pale, then flushed with fury. "You!" he hissed. "The maid! You should be dead! You were supposed to be dead!" "Elena." Alaric's voice was weak but clear. He'd pushed himself up onto one elbow, black blood still seeping from the wound in his chest. His silver eyes found hers across the chamber, and in them she saw shock, confusion, and something that might have been hope. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay away." "I came back to save you," Elena said simply. She opened her satchel and pulled out the sheaf of documents, holding them high. And to show the council the truth about their beloved Counselor Matthias and his conspiracy. Matthias moved with supernatural speed, lunging for her. But two other counselors blocked his path, Vera and old Dominic, both of whom looked deeply suspicious now. "Let her speak," Vera commanded. "I want to hear what evidence this human thinks she has." Elena's hands trembled as she began laying out the documents on the nearest table. "5 years ago, I overheard Counselor Matthias and others plotting against King Alaric. When I reported it, the king sent me away for my own safety. I didn't understand why then, but I do now. This conspiracy is bigger than a simple coup. They plan to break the blood covenant." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Breaking the blood covenant was heresy, the darkest of taboos. "Lies," Matthias snarled. "She's a human spy, sent by our enemies to sow discord." "Then explain these letters," Elena shot back, holding up a bundle of correspondence. "Explain the convergence, the ritual, the timing. Explain this ledger showing payments to the assassins who killed Counselor Lydia when she discovered your plot. Explain this document from the Forbidden Vault that describes the ritual you're about to propose, a ritual that requires the voluntary participation of the Council to break the blood covenant and transfer Alaric's power to a new vessel." She met his eyes steadily. "Explain why the blade you used was common steel instead of silver. You don't want him dead, do you, Matthias? You want him alive just long enough to complete the ritual, to use his death as the catalyst to shatter the covenant. Then you'll drain his power and take it for yourself, or give it to whoever is really leading this conspiracy." The silence that followed was absolute. Counselor Dominic moved to the table, his ancient hands shuffling through Elena's documents with careful precision. His expression grew darker with each page he examined. "This is damning," he said finally. "These are genuine. Matthias, how do you answer these charges?" Matthias's composure cracked. His fangs extended, his eyes flashing red. "You fools! You absolute fools! Do you think the old ways can last forever? The blood covenant has made us weak. We bow to humans, we restrict our feeding, we pretend we're civilized monsters playing at civilization. But we are predators, we are the apex, and it's time we stopped apologizing for it." "There are others," Elena said, her voice cutting through his rant. "Matthias isn't alone. 3 other counselors are part of this. Balthasar, Morgana, and Theron. They're the inner circle. But there's someone else, someone pulling the strings. Someone who gains from the chaos that would follow breaking the covenant." "Impossible," Balthasar said, stepping forward. He was a tall vampire with cold blue eyes. "This girl is making wild accusations. Your signature is on the letter to the Shadowmere clan offering them territory in exchange for supporting the coup," Elena interrupted, pointing to one of the documents. "And Morgana's is on the contract with the blood mages of the Eastern Wastes. Theron's is on the order to have Counselor Lydia killed when she got too close to the truth." One by one, the accused counselors' faces betrayed them. And one by one, the other council members began to understand the scope of the betrayal. But Alaric, still wounded on the floor, was looking at Elena with an expression that broke her heart. "You came back," he whispered. "After I sent you away, after I gave you the chance to escape this madness, you came back." Elena knelt beside him, setting down her satchel to press her hands against his wound. Her hands came away black with his blood. "You saved my life 5 years ago by sending me away. Did you think I wouldn't return the favor? I sent you away because I knew they would use you against me," Alaric said, his voice strained with pain and emotion. "I saw how you looked at me, Elena, how you lingered when you brought my evening wine, how you smiled when I remembered your name. And I knew that if they realized you were anything more than a servant to me, they would torture you to break me. So I broke your heart first, cleanly, to save your life." Elena's breath caught. "You cared for me? I am 300 years old," Alaric said softly. "I have seen empires rise and fall. I have loved and lost more times than you can imagine. But when I looked at you, a human maid with kind eyes and an honest smile, I felt something I thought I'd forgotten. Hope, possibility, a future beyond the endless political games of immortal courtiers. And that made you the most dangerous person in my world, because my enemies would have sensed it and destroyed you to hurt me." Tears stung Elena's eyes. "You could have told me." "Would you have left if I had?" She couldn't answer that, because they both knew the truth. She would have stayed, and she would have died. The moment was shattered by Matthias' bitter laughter. How touching! The vampire king and his human pet reunited in tragedy. "But it changes nothing. You may have exposed us, but look around, Your Majesty. You're wounded, possibly dying. Half the council is loyal to me, and the Crimson Eclipse is reaching its peak. We don't need your cooperation anymore. We can force the ritual." He moved his hands in a complex gesture, and suddenly 3 things happened at once. First, Balthazar, Morgana, and Theron all began chanting in an ancient language, their voices harmonizing into something that made Elena's teeth ache and her vision blur. Second, the glamour on Matthias' blade dissipated, revealing the true weapon underneath, not steel at all, but a dagger made of crystallized vampire blood, pulsing with dark magic, a weapon specifically designed to channel the life force of its victim. Third, the shadows in the corner of the chamber began to move and coalesce into a figure, a 5th conspirator, the puppet master Elena had suspected existed. The figure that emerged from the darkness was Lord Casimir Wraithborn, the ambassador from the neighboring Shadow Court. He was an elegant vampire with white hair and eyes like polished obsidian, and his smile was the coldest thing Elena had ever seen. "Well done, little maid," Casimir said, his voice smooth as silk. "You've performed admirably. You gathered the evidence, you returned at precisely the right moment, and you've even managed to distract everyone long enough for us to reach the critical phase of the ritual. I couldn't have planned it better myself." Elena's stomach dropped. "No, no, I came here to stop you." "And you thought I didn't know you were coming?" Casimir laughed. "My dear child, I've been watching you for 6 months." Why do you think Lydia found you of all people? Why do you think you were able to gather evidence so easily? I needed someone to bring the truth to light at exactly the right moment, not too early when Alaric could have prevented it, but not too late when it wouldn't matter. You were perfect, a loyal servant with a pure heart and a desperate need to save her king. You did exactly what I needed you to do. The betrayal hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been manipulated from the beginning, used. Alaric, however, was watching Casimir with narrowed eyes. The Shadow Cord has been bound by treaty for 2 centuries. Why break it now? Because your precious blood covenant is the only thing preventing my court from expanding into your territories, Casimir replied. Break the covenant, start a war between vampires and humans, and in the chaos, the Shadow Court will sweep in as peacekeepers and absorb the Nightborn Kingdom. Simple geopolitics, really. Matthias and his fellow idiots thought they would rule as tyrants. They don't realize they'll be the first ones I eliminate once you're dead and the covenant is broken. Matthias's face paled as he realized he'd been played as thoroughly as Elena had. You can't, Counselor Vera said, stepping forward with her hands raised in a defensive posture. We won't let you. Casimir gestured lazily, and Vera froze mid-sentence, her body locked in place by invisible bonds. You misunderstand your situation. The ritual is already in motion. The Crimson Eclipse is at its peak, and Alaric is dying from a wound that will kill him in minutes, not hours. There's nothing any of you can do except watch as 1,000 years of peace ends and a new age of darkness. Elena felt the weight of despair settling over her. She'd failed. Worse than failed, she'd been used to guarantee the conspirators' success. Everything she'd done had played into Casimir's hands. But then she felt Alaric's fingers close around her wrist, and she looked down to see him watching her with those silver eyes that had haunted her dreams for 5 years. "Elena," he said quietly, "do you trust me?" It was an absurd question given the circumstances, but looking at him, wounded, betrayed, facing death and the destruction of everything he'd built, she saw not a monster or a king, but a man who had sacrificed his own happiness to protect hers, a man who had carried the burden of this conspiracy alone for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to act, a man who, even now, was still fighting. "Yes," she said simply, "I trust you." Alaric smiled, and it transformed his face. "Then forgive me for what I'm about to do." He pulled her down and sank his fangs into her throat. The council chamber erupted in shouts of horror and confusion, but Elena barely heard them. The sensation of Alaric's bite was not pain, it was revelation. His ancient blood mingled with hers, and suddenly she could see the magical currents flowing through the room, could feel the pulse of the Crimson Eclipse overhead, could sense the ritual that Matthias and his conspirators were trying to complete. And she understood what Alaric was doing. The blood covenant could only be broken by the Guardian's death during the convergence. But what if the Guardian didn't die? What if instead he transferred his guardianship to another, someone who carried his blood and his power, someone who could hold the covenant intact until the eclipse passed? Alaric was turning her, not as a vampire, not fully, but as something in between, a dhampir, a bridge between human and vampire, capable of holding both natures in balance. The perfect guardian for a covenant that protected both species. When he pulled away, his eyes were bright with the blood he'd taken from her, and Elena felt power singing through her veins like electricity. She was stronger, faster, her senses sharper than any human's, but without the full burden of vampirism. She could feel the covenant like a living thing, bound to her now instead of to Alaric. "No!" Casimir snarled, his composure finally cracking. "That's not possible. The ritual requires the Guardian's death." "The ritual requires the Guardian's power to pass on," Alaric corrected, his voice growing stronger even as his wound began to slowly heal. "I've passed it to Elena. She is the Guardian now. And she's human enough that your ritual can't touch her. The covenant is safe." Matthias lunged forward with the blood crystal dagger, but Elena moved without thinking, her new dhampir speed allowing her to dodge and strike back. She caught his wrist and twisted, and the dagger clattered to the floor. "It's over," she said, her voice carrying a resonance that hadn't been there before. "The covenant stands. The conspiracy is exposed. Surrender." But Casimir was not finished. "If I cannot break the covenant through ritual, then I'll break it through war. Matthias, Balthazar, Morgana, Theron, kill them. Kill them all. Let the council's blood be the spark that ignites the realm." The four conspirators, bound by whatever dark magic Casimir wielded, attacked with the desperate fury of the doomed. But they were not prepared for what happened next. The loyal counselors, Vera, Dominic, and 7 others, formed a protective circle around Alaric and Elena, their combined power creating a shield against the assault. And Elena, with her new Dampier abilities and the authority of the Covenant flowing through her, spoke a word of command that resonated with ancient magic. "Stop." It was not a request. It was a binding, powered by the Covenant itself. The four conspirators froze, their bodies locked in place as surely as if they'd been turned to stone. Casimir stared at her in shock. "How did you? That's not... Guardians can't." "Apparently Dampier Guardians can," Elena said with a fierce smile. The Covenant protects both humans and vampires, which means it gives me authority over both, including vampire traitors who threaten the peace. She turned to Alaric, who had managed to stand despite his wound. "Your Majesty, what is your judgment?" Alaric looked at the frozen conspirators, then at Casimir, who was backing toward the shadows. His expression was terrible in its cold fury. "Matthias, Balthazar, Morgana, and Theron, you are hereby stripped of your positions, your titles, and your freedom. You will be imprisoned in the deep vaults until such time as a full trial can be held. As for you, Casimir Wraithborn, you have violated the treaty between our courts and conspired to break the blood covenant. I declare the treaty null and void. You have 1 hour to leave my kingdom before I declare war on the Shadow Court." Casimir's face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Nightborn. You may have won tonight, but—" "1 hour," Alaric repeated. "The sun rises in 3. I suggest you run quickly." The shadow swallowed Casimir, and he vanished, but his final words echoed through the chamber. "This isn't over." The aftermath moved quickly. Loyal palace guards arrived to take the conspirators away. Healers tended to Alaric's wound, which was already closing thanks to his ancient vampire constitution. The other counselors dispersed to manage the crisis and ensure word of the conspiracy didn't spread beyond those who needed to know. And Elena found herself standing alone with Alaric in the empty council chamber as the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon. "How do you feel?" Alaric asked, studying her carefully. Elena examined her hands, still marveling at the strength and speed she could sense waiting beneath her skin. Strange, powerful, frightened. "I'm not human anymore, but I'm not a vampire either. What am I?" "You're a guardian," Alaric said softly, "and you're the person who saved my kingdom when I couldn't." "The person who risked everything to do what was right." He paused, then added quietly, "The person I sent away 5 years ago because I was too much of a coward to admit I loved her." Elena's breath caught. "You love me?" "I have loved you from the moment you brought me evening wine and asked if I preferred it warmed," Alaric said, a sad smile touching his lips. "It was such a simple question, so human, so kind. No one had asked me my preference in centuries. They just assumed I wanted things a certain way because I was the king. But you saw me as a person first, and I fell in love with that kindness, that genuine care." He looked away. "But I am a vampire king with enemies in every shadow. And you were a human maid with a life that could be measured in decades, not centuries. So I sent you away because I loved you too much to let you die for me. And now? Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Now you're damp here, which means you'll live for centuries, but not forever. Now you're the guardian of the blood covenant, which means you have enemies of your own. Now you're bound to this kingdom and its politics in ways you never asked for. Alaric stepped closer, his silver eyes searching hers. I have even less right to ask for your love than I did 5 years ago. But I'm asking anyway, because I'm a selfish creature who cannot bear to lose you again. Elena thought about the 5 years she'd spent in Ashenmoor, working as a seamstress and trying to forget the vampire king who had broken her heart to save her life. She thought about the months she'd spent investigating, driven by a loyalty she couldn't explain to a man who had banished her. She thought about the moment she'd seen him fall in the council chamber and the terror that had gripped her heart. She thought about all of it, and she realized the truth had been obvious all along. I love you too, she said simply. I think I always have. I was so angry when you sent me away, so hurt and confused. But even in exile, I couldn't forget you. And when I learned you were in danger, there was never any question about coming back. Because you were worth saving, worth fighting for, worth loving, even if it meant giving up my humanity. Alaric closed the distance between them, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that belied his supernatural strength. I will spend the rest of my very long life trying to be worthy of that love. You already are, Elena said, and kissed him as the sun rose over the obsidian palace. The weeks that followed were chaotic. The conspiracy had been deep and wide-reaching, and rooting out all of its branches took time and effort. Elena found herself thrust into a role she'd never imagined, not just as the guardian of the blood covenant, but as Alaric's partner in ruling. The council accepted her after she proved her worth a dozen times over, using her unique position as a vampire to bridge the gap between human and vampire concerns. Matthias and his co-conspirators were tried and convicted, then imprisoned in the deep vaults where they would spend the next century contemplating their treachery. Casimir and the Shadow Court proved to be an ongoing problem, but without the element of surprise, their plots were easier to counter. War was averted, though the peace remained tense. Elena learned to navigate her new existence as a vampire. She was stronger and faster than any human, with senses that rivaled a vampire's. But she could walk in sunlight and eat human food and maintain connections to the human world in ways pure vampires couldn't. It made her the perfect guardian for a covenant that protected both species. But more than that, she learned what it meant to be loved by an immortal. Alaric was patient and passionate by turns, teaching her about vampire culture and history while learning from her about human hopes and dreams. They were opposites in many ways, ancient and young, vampire and human-touched, king and former maid, but they balanced each other perfectly. 3 months after the night of the Crimson Eclipse, Elena stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, looking out over the obsidian palace and the city beyond. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, and she felt Alaric's arms wrap around her from behind. "Penny, for your thoughts," he murmured against her ear. "I was thinking about that night," Elena admitted, "about how I walked into that chamber expecting to save you, and instead you saved me, transformed me, made me into something I never could have imagined." "Do you regret it?" Elena turned in his arms to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his ancient silver eyes. "Never. I regret that we wasted 5 years apart. I regret that it took a conspiracy and an assassination attempt to bring us together. But I don't regret a single moment since you bit me and made me your guardian." Our guardian, Alaric corrected gently. The covenant belongs to all of us. You're just the one who carries it. Then I regret nothing about becoming the guardian, Elena said firmly. This is where I'm meant to be, with you, protecting the peace between our peoples, building a future that's better than the past. Alaric smiled and kissed her as the last light of day faded into the velvet darkness of night, the time when both humans dreamed and vampires woke, when both worlds existed in harmony. I love you, Elena Thorne, he said softly. My guardian, my partner, my reason for believing in hope. I love you too, Alaric Nightborn, she replied. My king, my maker, my home. They stood together on the balcony as the stars emerged overhead, two souls from different worlds bound together by love and blood and an unbreakable covenant. The kingdom stretched out before them, full of challenges and dangers and possibilities. But they would face it all together, now and always. 1 year later, Elena stood in the Grand Council chamber again. But this time, the circumstances were vastly different. Instead of conspiracy and betrayal, the room was filled with celebration. Instead of assassins and traitors, the council members were gathered to witness history. King Alaric Nightborn, ruler of the Obsidian Throne, took Elena's hand and led her to the center of the chamber. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, and around her throat was a collar of silver and moonstone, the mark of a vampire guardian. Members of the council, Alaric began, his voice carrying through the chamber. You have witnessed over the past year how Elena has served as guardian of the blood covenant. She has mediated disputes between human and vampire populations. She has strengthened the protections that keep our peoples in harmony. She has proven herself worthy of the power she carries and the trust we place in her. He turned to Elena, and his silver eyes held all the love and devotion she'd ever dreamed of seeing there. But she has done more than that. She has taught me that strength comes not from power or immortality, but from courage and compassion. She has shown me that love can bridge any divide, even that between human and vampire. She has reminded me why we created the blood covenant in the first place, to build a world where both our peoples can thrive together. Alaric went down on one knee before her, and the chamber went absolutely silent. Elena Thorne, he said, his voice solemn and sure, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Will you stand beside me not just as guardian of the covenant, but as my queen? Will you help me rule with wisdom and justice and build a future our peoples can be proud of? Elena felt tears streaming down her face, tears of joy, of love, of gratitude for the impossible, perfect moment. A year ago, she'd been an exiled maid with nothing to her name but a bag of evidence and a desperate hope. Now she was a vampire guardian, and the vampire king she loved was proposing marriage. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Alaric stood and slipped a ring onto her finger, a band of white gold set with a stone that seemed to hold captured starlight. Then he kissed her as the council chamber erupted in applause and cheering. When they finally broke apart, Councillor Vera stepped forward with a broad smile. Your Majesty, Lady Elena, the council formally recognizes this betrothal and offers our blessing and support. May your union bring strength to the kingdom and the covenant. May your love be a light in the darkness, old Dominic added, his voice gruff with emotion. One by one, the councillors came forward to offer congratulations and blessings. Even those who had initially been skeptical of Elena had come to respect and admire her. She had proven herself through deeds, not words, and earned her place in the kingdom's hierarchy. As the celebration continued around them, Alaric pulled Elena close and whispered in her ear, Thank you for coming back. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me despite everything." Elena smiled against his shoulder. "Thank you for sending me away 5 years ago," she whispered back. "Thank you for loving me enough to break my heart to save my life. Thank you for making me strong enough to save yours in return." They stood together at the center of the council chamber, surrounded by friends and allies, and Elena felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged. This was her destiny, not as a poor maid cleaning endless corridors, but as a guardian, a queen, a bridge between worlds. The road ahead would not be easy. Casimir and the Shadow Court still posed a threat. There would be other conspiracies, other challenges, other dangers to face. But she would face them all with Alaric at her side, and with the strength of the blood covenant flowing through her veins. The vampire king had been betrayed by his own council, but a poor maid had returned to expose them all, and in doing so had found not just justice, but love. And that, Elena thought, as she looked up at her king, her love, her future, was the greatest magic of all. The wedding took place 3 months later, on a night when the moon hung full and bright above the obsidian palace. It was a ceremony that blended vampire and human traditions, overseen by both a vampire elder and a human priest. The great hall was filled with nobles from across the kingdom, both vampire and human, all gathered to witness the union of their king and his Dhampir guardian. Elena walked down the aisle in a gown of white and silver, her hand held by Counselor Vera, who had become something of a mentor to her. At the end of the aisle stood Alaric in black velvet and silver embroidery, his silver eyes shining with barely contained emotion. When Elena reached him, he took both her hands in his and spoke the ancient vows that had bound vampire marriages for millennia. Elena responded with the human vows she'd learned as a child, promising to love and honor and cherish through all the days of her long life. And when the priest and the elder both pronounced them wed, Alaric kissed his bride before the assembled court, sealing their union with a love that had survived betrayal, conspiracy, and the weight of destiny itself. The celebration that followed lasted until dawn. There was music and dancing, blood wine for the vampires and regular wine for the humans, and a feast that showcased the best of both cultures. Elena danced with Alaric, of course, but also with old Dominic and several human dignitaries, and even once with Vera, who told her gruffly that she'd make a fine queen. "I don't know how to be a queen," Elena admitted as they waltzed through the great hall. "None of us know how to be what we become," Vera replied with a knowing smile. "We simply do our best and learn as we go. You've already proven you have the courage and the heart for it. The rest is just practice." As the night wore on, Alaric stole Elena away from the celebration, leading her up to the highest tower of the palace, where they could look out over the kingdom together. The city lights twinkled below them like earthbound stars, and in the distance they could see the human settlements that existed under the kingdom's protection. "Do you know what I love most about you?" Alaric asked, pulling Elena close. "What?" she asked, leaning into his embrace. "That you never let anyone tell you who you should be," he said. "When I sent you away, you could have become bitter. When you discovered the conspiracy, you could have hidden and protected yourself. When I offered you the power of guardianship, you could have refused. But at every turn, you chose courage over fear, love over hate, action over paralysis. You made yourself into exactly who you wanted to be." Elena thought about that, about the journey from frightened maid to confident guardian to queen. "I had a good teacher," she said softly. "A king who showed me that love sometimes means sacrifice, that protecting others can require breaking your own heart, that real strength is knowing when to fight and when to let go. "And now we never have to let go again," Alaric said, tilting her face up to kiss her under the stars. Elena kissed him back, pouring into it all the love and devotion and gratitude she felt. When they finally broke apart, she rested her head against his chest and listened to the slow, steady beat of his ancient heart. "What happens now?" she asked. "We've stopped the conspiracy, saved the covenant, gotten married. What's next for us?" Alaric laughed, the sound warm and content. Now we rule. We build. We create a kingdom that's worthy of the peace we fought so hard to protect. We deal with the Shadow Court and any other threats that emerge. We show our peoples that vampire and human can not only coexist, but thrive together.
And between all that?
Eleanor prompted. "Between all that," Alaric said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur, "we love each other. We dance on nights like this. We steal moments of peace whenever we can. We build a life together that's worth all the centuries I've lived and all the years you've given up your humanity for."
I didn't give up my humanity,
Elena corrected gently. "I transformed it, made it stronger, made it enough to stand beside yours." "You're right," Alaric agreed, "and that transformation is why you'll be a great queen, because you understand both worlds. You've lived as human, and now you live as vampire. You can see the needs and fears and hopes of both our peoples. That perspective is invaluable."
They've stood together on the tower for a long while, watching the city sleep and the stars wheel overhead. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, they made their way back down to their chambers.
The royal suite had been transformed for the wedding night. Candles everywhere, flowers in shades of white and crimson, silk sheets on the enormous bed. It should have been intimidating, but with Alaric's hand in hers, Elena felt only anticipation.
"Are you nervous?"
Alaric asked as they stood at the threshold.
"No,"
Elena said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with. What is there to be nervous about?" Alaric smiled, and the love in his expression was almost overwhelming. "Nothing at all, my queen, nothing at all." He swept her up into his arms, carried her across the threshold, and closed the door behind them. And whatever happened in that chamber stayed between husband and wife, king and queen, vampire and dampire, two souls bound together by love and blood and an unbreakable bond. The dawn broke over the obsidian palace, painting the spires in shades of rose and gold. In the city below, humans and vampires alike were waking to a new day in a kingdom that had survived conspiracy and betrayal to emerge stronger than before. And in the royal chambers, the vampire king held his dampire queen close, both of them finally at peace after years of separation and sacrifice. They had faced darkness together and emerged victorious. They had proven that love could conquer even the deepest treachery. Now they would build a future together, a future of hope, harmony, and happiness. The poor maid who had once cleaned the palace corridors had become a queen. The lonely vampire king who had thought himself beyond love had found his soulmate. And the kingdom they ruled together would be better for it. 5 years later, Elena stood in the council chamber once more, but now she stood at Alaric's side as his equal. The council had grown and changed. New members had been added, including several humans who served as liaisons between the vampire government and human communities. Today's session was crucial. Ambassadors from the Shadow Court had requested a formal meeting to discuss a new treaty. In the 5 years since the failed conspiracy, Casimir had been deposed by his own court, and new leadership had emerged, leadership that claimed to want genuine peace. Elena had her doubts, but Alaric had taught her the value of diplomacy. "We listen," he'd said that morning over breakfast. "We negotiate in good faith. But we remain vigilant. Trust, but verify." The Shadow Court ambassadors were escorted into the chamber by palace guards. To Elena's surprise, the lead ambassador was a vampire woman she recognized from her research all those years ago, Lady Seraphine, who had been one of Casimir's most vocal opponents before his downfall. "Your Majesties," Seraphine said, bowing respectfully to both Alaric and Elena. "Thank you for receiving us. My court wishes to formally apologize for Lord Casimir's actions and to propose a new treaty based on mutual respect and the principles of the Blood Covenant." Elena exchanged a glance with Alaric. In their years together, they'd developed an almost telepathic understanding. She could read the cautious hope in his eyes, tempered by the same wariness she felt. "We are willing to discuss terms," Alaric said formally, "but understand that any treaty must include strict provisions against interference in our kingdom's affairs and protections for the Blood Covenant." "Of course," Seraphine agreed. "In fact, we wish to propose something unprecedented, that the Shadow Court adopt its own version of the Blood Covenant, with you, Queen Elena, serving as guardian for both kingdoms." The council chamber erupted in surprised murmurs. Elena felt her heart skip. It was a stunning proposal, one that would extend the protections she'd fought so hard to preserve across an entire second kingdom. But it was also an enormous responsibility. "May I speak privately with my husband and council?" Elena asked. "Of course, Your Majesty." Once the ambassadors had been escorted to a waiting room, Elena turned to the council. "What do you think? Is this genuine or another plot?" Old Dominic, now the council's senior member, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "I've had my people investigating the Shadow Court's new regime. By all accounts, they're sincere. Casimir's tyranny nearly destroyed them. They're looking for a new path forward." "But extending the covenant is dangerous," Councillor Vera pointed out. "It will make Elena's duties twice as complex and potentially put her in danger from Shadow Court enemies." Elena listened to the debate swirl around her, then held up a hand for silence. "The Blood Covenant exists to protect both humans and vampires, to create a world where both can thrive. If the Shadow Court is genuinely willing to embrace those principles, how can we refuse? Isn't that exactly what we've been fighting for? A world where peace spreads beyond our borders?" Alaric took her hand, squeezing gently. "It will be difficult. You'll need to travel between kingdoms, mediate disputes in unfamiliar territory, deal with Shadow Court politics." "I've dealt with assassins and conspirators," Elena said with a wry smile. "I think I can handle some politics." And besides, she looked around at the council members, who had become her friends and advisors over the past 5 years. "I won't be doing it alone. I'll have all of you supporting me. And I'll have you," she added, turning to Alaric, "by my side. Always," he promised. The vote was unanimous. They would negotiate a new treaty with the Shadow Court, one that would extend the Blood Covenant's protections and principles to a second kingdom. It would be challenging, potentially dangerous, but it was the right thing to do. When the ambassadors were brought back in and given the news, Lady Seraphine's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Your Majesties. You won't regret this. The Shadow Court is ready for change, and Queen Elena's guardianship will help us build something better." The negotiations took months, but eventually a treaty was signed. Elena became guardian of the Blood Covenant for both the Obsidian Kingdom and the Shadow Court territories. It meant more work, more travel, more responsibility, but it also meant that millions more humans and vampires would live under the Covenant's protections. On the night the treaty was ratified, Elena and Alaric stood together in their private chambers, exhausted but satisfied. "We did it," Elena said, leaning against him. "We actually did it. peace spreading beyond our borders, the covenant growing stronger, not weaker. You did it, Alaric corrected. Your courage 5 years ago set all of this in motion. Your strength as guardian made it possible. Your wisdom as queen made it happen. Elena shook her head. We did it together. That's what makes us strong. We're partners, equal in all things. Your experience and my fresh perspective. Your power and my humanity. Your kingdom and my guardianship. Together, we're unstoppable. Alaric turned her in his arms, his silver eyes soft with love. Do you ever miss it, your old life, before all this? Elena thought about the question seriously. Did she miss cleaning corridors and living in obscurity? Did she miss the simplicity of being nobody important? No, she said finally. I miss the innocence sometimes, the time before I knew about conspiracies and betrayals and the weight of kingdoms. But I don't miss the powerlessness. I don't miss not mattering. And I definitely don't miss not having you in my life. I spent 300 years without you, Alaric said softly, and now I can't imagine existing without you. You're not just my queen, Elena. You're my partner, my best friend, my reason for believing the world can be better than it is. We'll make it better, Elena promised. One day at a time, one treaty at a time, one protected life at a time. We'll build the world we want to live in. Together, Alaric agreed. Always, Elena confirmed. They kissed as the stars wheeled overhead, two souls from different worlds bound together by love and blood. The Vampire King and his Dampier Queen, ruling a kingdom of light and shadow, building a future where all peoples could thrive. It had all started with a betrayal, a council conspiracy, an assassination attempt, a failed plot. But it had ended with triumph. The poor maid had returned. The evidence had been revealed. The traitors had been exposed. Justice had been served. And in the process, two hearts had found each other against all odds, proving that even in the darkest of nights, love could be the brightest light. The Obsidian Kingdom and the Shadow Court flourished under the expanded Blood Covenant. Elena traveled between the territories, settling disputes and strengthening the protections that kept humans and vampires in harmony. Alaric ruled with wisdom and justice, always with Elena at his side when she was home, always consulting her counsel even when she was away. Years passed, then decades. The world changed around them, but their love remained constant. The one true thing in a world of political machinations and magical intrigues. And on quiet nights, when they stood together on the palace balcony and looked out over the kingdom they protected, Elena would sometimes remember that long-ago day when she'd been nothing but a poor maid with dreams she'd never dared speak aloud. She'd become so much more than she'd ever imagined possible. Not because of the power she wielded or the crown she wore, but because of the love she'd found and the purpose she'd discovered. The Vampire King had been betrayed by his own council, but a poor maid had returned to expose them all, and in doing so had transformed not just herself, but an entire kingdom, had proven that courage and love could overcome any darkness. That was the story she would tell in the years to come, when young vampires and humans alike asked how peace had come to their lands. That was the legacy she would leave, not of power, but of perseverance, not of violence, but of victory through virtue. The Vampire King and his Dampier Queen ruled together for centuries, guardians of peace, champions of harmony, living proof that love could bridge any divide. And they lived, if not quite happily ever after, for happiness is never perfect or permanent, then at least contentedly, purposefully, and surrounded by the evidence of the better world they had built together. The end.